Samir es el director ejecutivo y fundador de Datasum, una firma consultora boutique que ayuda a organizaciones medianas, multinacionales, a identificar oportunidades comerciales, priorizar y ofrecer iniciativas de creación de valor, aprovechar los datos para aumentar justamente las ganancias de cada una de ellas. Como líder en estrategia y análisis de datos, durante más de 20 años ha brindado constantemente programas de trabajo excepcionales en el campo de la analítica, lo que lo convierte en un activo invaluable para cada una de las organizaciones. Anteriormente ocupó puestos destacados en empresas de renombre, incluidas Accenture, Computer Science Corporation, Crisis International y Vertex Decision Science. También es un gran conferencista y anfitrión de podcast Data Strategy Show, votado entre los 6 mejores podcasts del 2023 por profesionales de datos y analítica de todo el mundo. Un aplauso, por favor, para Samir.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Mirta, and thank you, everybody. Thank you, CDO LATAM, for the invite. As you can tell from my accent, I'm from London, so unfortunately I don't speak any Spanish. But I know that we have translators, which is good, because my Spanish is so poor. Your English is probably much better than my Spanish. So, why am I here today? Today I'm going to be speaking about operating models, something that's often forgotten, overlooked, and not really understood in most data transformations, digital transformations that most companies will try to implement. So it's how operating models drive success in data strategy and culture, which is very important. So, just to set the scene, really what I'm going to do is just go through some of the challenges that I see within organizations that I have worked with, and what they're dealing with now with the likes of Gen AI and LLMs, and AI coming to the fore, but not forgetting all the practical foundations, things that Cindy talked about earlier, which should be on the minds of most corporations. The role of an operating model, a success story, and how do you choose the right model, and then... So, you've heard a little bit about me. I'm not going to go on about myself too much. One thing I will tell you is that you can see this little icon here. I have created something called the Data Strategy Canvas. I'm more than happy to speak to you about it. You can catch me afterwards, you can catch me tomorrow. It's basically how you accelerate your data transformation initiatives in your organizations. The other thing, just for fun here, is I am a trained charity auctioneer, so I stand up in front of people and sell things. I did that at Christie's International, and I sold the largest white Tuscan truffle for $330,000 in Macau in 2007, and it was for charity. So we raised about 10 million that year for charity. So just some fun things about me that you might not know. What are we dealing with in the realms of data, analytics, and AI right now? And these are things that I speak to CDOs about, heads of data, CEOs, CFOs everywhere. A lot of I'm having this conversation with Ivan over lunch. A lot of the conversations that I'm having right now are with CFOs, because CFOs are beginning to realize the importance of data and analytics. And not only that, but how do we start to make better business cases for data and analytics? And now AI. I mean, AI is just the sophisticated way of doing analytics, I guess, but everybody wants to call it AI now. We've been doing machine learning for a long time. So while we're in this really weird state as the industry, we've been doing this now for 20 years. The first chief data officer came out in 2002. That was when I started in data as well. And, since then, we're still struggling with data governance, quality, trying to build the right investment cases, proving value to organizations, to the CEOs. How do we do that? How do we measure what we're trying to implement? So I'm not going to talk about those things there. I think it's quite interesting for me to see that what I could have seen in 2002, I'm still seeing today in many cases. The issues and challenges with data. Where is it? How do we get to it? Who owns it, if there is any kind of thing called ownership, which I still struggle with. Alignment between strategy. How do we absolutely create a data strategy that links to the business strategy? And it shouldn't be in an island of its own. It should always be hinged on the on the business strategy itself. So these challenges right now are being felt by many organizations, large, medium, and small. It's not just the medium-sized organizations. I worked with an organization recently who's 38 billion in revenue. They're worldwide, and they are still struggling with how to push data and analytics into their business units. How do they get the value? How do they make sure they protect their data? Because they're an engineering firm, there's a lot of IP. So these are big, big challenges that people are dealing with. But this is one of the starkest and brutal things that I've seen recently and heard at Gartner, at their data and analytics conference in 2023, which for me really sums it up in one quote, which is Gartner reviewed 500 data strategies. Now, these were their clients, okay? Biggest clients, Gartner, you know Gartner, they always have the FTSE 500 clients, you know, in their bag. And out of those 500 data strategies, only 6% were actual data strategies. And what I mean by that, and what they mean by that, is most were missing the link between an operating model and value. How do we, bring that business value to what we're doing? So these two things, in this day and age, in 2022, is massively overshadowed in terms of what we're trying to achieve. Everybody is focusing on technology. Everybody's focusing on the new shiny tool that's just been introduced, the new LLM, or the new data lake or data lakehouse, or whatever we want to call it, the data swamp, etc. But this is where we're leading to. Lots of investment in technology, but little payback. So if Gartner have seen that, and that's 6% of those 500, can you imagine organizations around the world who aren't in their captive audience, who are doing this, who actually are missing these components and more? So maybe you're there. Maybe you're missing these components. Maybe you don't have a data strategy. Maybe you haven't even focused on AI. Maybe you're still trying to work out, how do I get my BI up in the cloud? How do I start to deliver reports to my users? How do I start that, how do I get them to actually use my dashboards, which still people are struggling with? So this is a fundamental issue that we're seeing right now. But unfortunately, it doesn't stop there. There was a very interesting survey, and it's been going on now for 11 years. I don't know if you've seen if you've heard of New Vantage Partners. Has anybody heard of Randy Bean? Put your hand up. Okay, Randy Bean, yeah, you know him. Somebody in the back as well. So Randy Bean runs an organization called New Vantage Partners. They've been doing this survey for the last 11 years to all data and analytics executives across, again, probably FTSE 250 companies. And what they found is that while investments in data and analytics are increasing, and there is traction, I'm not saying there isn't, what they are finding, though, is there's little investment in change management and culture. And this is another factor that is failing the data transformation initiatives that are happening right now, because we don't focus on change management in its true sense, not just stakeholder mapping. That's not change management. How do we get people to change their mindset? How do we get an organization to change their mindsets? That's the fundamental question. So as you can see, not only is it operating model and the business value realization, here it's things around, change in business transformation, organizational processes, people and skills, organizational alignment, and communications. And those are the biggest obstacles to realizing business value. So 79.8% of those data leaders cite those issues to actually them being successful, being able to scale their initiatives, being able to embed themselves into a business line, being able to provide true value to an organization. And this is where we are in 2023. But in 2022, when I started, it was pretty much the first time that we even looked at data, but we could get data quicker. We could get it faster to our frontline people. because it was in specific systems that weren't. We have a saying in England, there's a motorway system in England, maybe you have one in here in Mexico. It looks like Spaghetti Junction. Yeah? Now we have Spaghetti Junction in most of our organizations. That's causing a lot of these problems as well. So those are the two facts that we've got to think about when you in your organizations are starting to think about your strategies, aligning them with the business, thinking about how you mobilize your teams, thinking about how you get value, thinking about how you start to prove the ROI on your initiatives. You've got to start thinking about this stuff. So, this is the fundamental questions that I get asked daily by organizations, all the time. We are struggling. We don't know what's happening. We can't get our users to utilize the products that we're providing them. Some of them don't work. The data's bad. How do we get ourselves into a place where we can scale our efforts? You know, what do we need to do? And the answer really is the operating model. And how we absolutely take strategy and execution of that strategy and put in the middle the operating model, because that's what it is. Most organizations will say, let's go from strategy all the way to execution and implementation without even thinking about that. They'll just try and put some technology in and start to drive out some data products and not think about how they're going to get it into the hands of the users, how they're going to productionize it, how it's going to be effective in the value chain along their business. Is it going to get into the hands of my partners quickly? Is it going to, are the suppliers going to be able to give me that data? So there's lots of different factors and variables that we have to think about. So what is an operating model? It's, as it says, a collection of capabilities. That's what I term it as. And those capabilities I put into a four-quadrant model, because every consultant likes to have a model with 4 quadrants, right? It's a normal thing. And what are those 4 quadrants? And the other thing I say about operating model is it's how you make your strategy real. Okay, that's how you absolutely implement it properly, through defined processes, through the right capabilities, getting the right people in place, having the right governance. So if you imagine, what most people have is they have this thing called a business strategy, right? I hope that people have something called a business strategy. I've been into organizations where I've had to tease that out of the C-suite executives to say, what is the strategy of the company? Where are we going? What are the objectives you're trying to achieve over a certain period of time? Which domains are those going to be affecting? Because what I want to know as a data person is, how am I going to increase that revenue or reduce that risk through regulation? Or how am I going to optimize the cost efficiencies in the business? That's what I want to know. And I want to know by what percentage, over what time. That's a real strategic objective. That's what you all should be thinking about. When somebody says to me, we want to grow our revenue, that's not a strategic objective. To me, that's just a statement. It's a sweeping statement where people will just think about generic terms. I want to know, is it by 5%, 10%? Is it by 2030? Is it in a specific region? So think about your business strategy. And we as data practitioners get too caught up in, data itself. And technology. Data and technology are purely enablers. There you go, I said it. I'm sorry, I said it, but they really are. They're enablers to drive the business objectives, to get success in what the business does and how they achieve their goals. So, what we normally have with a business strategy is we normally have a vision. And that vision tells us where we're going, where we're headed in the future, what it looks like, how it's going to make us feel. What is the change that we need to make in the organization to enable that vision to be implemented? And within that, we are trying to get through this thing called value. We're trying to say, look, we've got a vision now. How do we absolutely operationalize that and drive out value for the operational teams? Operational excellence is something we talked about in the 90s, in the 80s. Things like total quality management came out of what, W.D. Demings would have talked about back in the 50s. So we've got to think about the vision to value motive. And what is that? Now, there's a bit of glue that sits between those two that holds the top line, the bottom line, and the two left to right. And that's the data strategy. That data strategy is always looking at whether it's driving the business strategy, whether it's achieving the vision, whether it's helping the operations to achieve what they need to do, and whether it's providing value. Now, this piece, on 2 occasions, we had the problem with business value realization and business value through both of those surveys. So we have a problem, obviously. It's around value. Now, the operating model helps you drive out what that value is. Why? Because we've got these 4 quadrants, as I said. We want to think about 4 things when we're trying to understand operating models. There are capabilities in our organizations that are required for us to achieve something. The capability is not, I'm going to build an algorithm. That's not a capability, it's a tool. Yeah? That's a means to an end. We are trying to build that algorithm to put into a decision system, or to provide a score to somebody, or to understand the propensity of somebody to buy a product. That's not the end point. So what we need to do is, we need to understand what is the talent and structure that we need in our organizations. Now, this might be really simple in terms of, yeah, of course we need people, but most organizations that I go and speak to will bring in data scientists to begin with. I did a survey on LinkedIn a while back, and it was about 6 months ago, and I asked everybody in my network, which is about 15,000 people, I didn't get 15,000 responses, but it went out to that many people. And most of the people, the data leaders in that specific set, in that cohort, they came back with saying that their first hire, it was about 70% would be a data scientist. Now, in my opinion, that's not the right first hire, because that's not going to give you an understanding of what value is going to drive. It may give you the art of the possible, but what we're trying to achieve is the art of the probable. We do want to understand what's possible, that's fine, and we can do that 3 months down the line after that first 100 days, but we really need to think what's probable. And the way we do that is understanding what talent and structure we need to begin with in our organizations. Who are they? Who are the people who are going to go out to the business and start to uncover the business use cases? Who are the people who are going to ask the questions around, how, if we do this for you, what money is it going to generate? Or what costs are we going to save? This is what we need to drive out, rather than what algorithm do we need to build? Is it a k-means clustering or, a classification algorithm? Who cares? Actually, is it going to provide me with my uplift in my marketing campaign, or is it going to help me to get that person to buy a product? So that talent and structure is so key. And also the structure. We'll come to operating model structures later, which have been around for a while, and they're evolving all the time because we've got new technologies and new concepts like data mesh that have come out, and data fabric and so on. So, they're evolving all the time, but they're fundamentally the same that they've been for the last 50 years. Systems and processes. I'm often asked, why don't data governance programs work? Why aren't they effective? Why aren't we achieving what we set out to do? The one reason is because it's not process-oriented. It's all about policy and procedure. And policy and procedure puts constraints on organizations because they think of it in terms of regulation or compliance. And when you think about process, you think about how do we move things along in our organization, and what is the data that underpins it. And in each domain, we have a set of data that helps us to understand that process. So systems and processes are essential to the way that we see what an operating model looks like, how we embed that into the value chain, how we put it into our supply chain with our partners, suppliers, distributors, because all of you here have got organizations which are probably having those ecosystems in the business model. How is it going to be influenced by this operating model? Governance. Now, we talk about governance, and I basically look at governance in 2 ways, actually 3 ways. And the third one I think about less so because it's too bureaucratic. The first one is data governance, which is fair enough. The second one now, which we've obviously seen, is AI governance, which we need to think about the ethics. We need to understand the bias. We need to understand the lineage of data. We need to know why the data scientist created the algorithm in the way they did, and what bias they've put into that code as well, which is really important that we need to do. So data and AI governance. The third one is the governance of how we work within the context in the organization. And this is where I don't like the bureaucratic nature of many organizations. And I'll come to the success story later, which is putting boards together, having councils, having meetings for meeting's sake, which actually doesn't help anybody. It just creates more fundamental bureaucracy, it creates more meetings, and no one makes a decision. So the thing about the operating model is, if you can get it to a point where you're having it embedded into the culture of the business, the way that the business culture works, and I have a fundamental difference with what people call data culture, because I don't agree that there is a data culture in an organization. There is only one culture, and that is the business culture. When we must understand and embed that governance within that culture, and what it does today, and how it's going to work tomorrow. So that's governance. And obviously, data. Data needs talent. Data needs systems and processes. Data needs governance. Governance needs the data to back it up. Governance needs systems and processes. Governance needs the talent and structure to help it. I could go on for days talking about how those blend together. So that's the fundamental structure of my framework that I've been using to deliver operating models. And really no one talks about the operating model because nobody really thinks about the fact that the glue between the strategy and the execution is how we make the business operate, how we make the strategy real. So if you can take anything away from today, it's the thought that you must have the conversation with yourselves in your data organizations about how you are going to think about an operating model for your organization. What does it look like? How will it affect the people in your business? How will it affect the culture? And I'll come to the things that you should be thinking about later on. So let's just quickly go into different types of operating models. When we started in our organizations, put your hands up. Who started in an organization which was quite immature in terms of its data practice? Okay, you can keep your hands raised. Keep your hands raised. Okay, so it's about 30%. Okay, fine. Who started it in an organization which was sort of mid-mature? I mean, had bolted out of the gate, had a system, had some dashboards. So one person, okay, so now we're getting to about 50% of the people. So I'm assuming the rest of you are probably working in far more mature organizations or getting to that point. Somebody shook their head and said no. Who worked in an organization which was not mature at all? Had nothing? Okay, so that's the rest of you. Fine. Okay, I got it now. Great. So you all probably started in those less mature organizations, or the sort of, just getting out the gate with centralized teams. The structures where you had somebody sitting, or a team, in a central facility that were responding to incoming requests. And that's fine. That's the maturity aspect of your capability, because the capability is what we're thinking about. How can we service the organization with what we have? And maybe that's a low maturity, and that's fine, because you need to build it out that way. And it was consistent. It was efficient because you were in control of the certain parameters around what you could do. You had control on governance to a point, because you could set the limits. You could set the guardrails around what you wanted to do and what you wanted to achieve. No one else was in the mix. So you kind of had, some good idea about where the data is for certain use cases. And you had the expertise. So because, it's a central team, you think, what is the low-hanging fruit we need to deliver now? Just to get our users to think about data, just to get our end users to understand what we have. So you had a little bit of expertise about digging in systems. Maybe you're a data analyst, writing some SQL code, or, trying to extract data and trying to work out what you could provide to the business based on those use cases. But there were bottlenecks. You couldn't take on a lot of requests for stuff because you'd have a big pile of things that were, backlog requests and so on. It was rigid. You couldn't really be flexible. You couldn't be agile enough to respond to different queries or different kinds of new technologies or new ways of working. But most people think about technology, and that's what the problem is here. Communication challenges, because the first entrants, the pioneers, as I call them, those people who traveled across America and landed themselves, in Indian country where they were, not having a good time, that was the first data teams. They weren't having a good time because they were having communication challenges. They didn't know how to communicate. So, these are the major challenges, and maybe you're still in that position now. There's things you can do, which is good, and the risk of overload. So, a decentralized model. Then we kind of think about, I want to think about, can I start to decentralize this? Now we're getting a little bit more mature. Who has a decentralized view? Who has a decentralized model in their team, in their business right now? Is anybody working on a decentralized? Somebody shake, you're doing kind of half-half, is it half-half? Yeah, okay. One person at the back. Okay, so yeah, there's a couple of people. So that's really about how do you distribute that into the business units? How do you start to get closer to the business? How do you start to respond to things quicker? Because the centralized teams couldn't. So we want to get closer. I often say we want to get closer to the edge. We want to get to the point where the business decision is made. We want to get to the point where actually that system is going to tell us what is happening and what decision or action needs to be taken. We are too far removed from that right now. So, as I said, it's the converse of the centralized. There's agility in there. There's ownership in the business. So decentralized puts some of the ownership back on the business because they start to realize, hey, I can do certain things with my team now. They're sitting right in front of me. Can I answer a new question that I've never asked? One of the questions that I ask when I go into businesses, which fundamentally stuns executives, and I see their faces when I do this, is normally people will go in and ask, what are the typical business questions you're asking? And they can rattle off all the questions in the world about their business. But what I ask is, what business questions aren't you asking? That fundamentally floors them because they've never really thought about those questions that will actually create a new business model, that will drive a different part of their revenue, that will understand what product might be, needed, rather than just staying with the same old business questions and the same old metrics that we keep on seeing. So, again, there's a lot of specialization here because you're closer to the business. You're actually understanding, what marketing needs, what HR needs, what engineering needs, whatever kind of, structure of business you're in. But the problem was, as people spread, the silos were apparent. Data silos were plagued in many of the departments and functions. There was inconsistency between what one team did and what the other team did because everybody thought, oh, now I can start to buy and get my own tools in because now I've got some flexibility, I've got some ownership. And what did that do? It then had a little bit of technical debt. Not a little bit, but a lot. Therefore, it drives out things like data debt, which is data everywhere in different pockets, not being used, wasted, not understanding the value of it. Security risks of people got stuff on their laptops and they leave it on a train and then somebody finds it. So this then became a really cool thing to think about. A hub and spoke, can we have a mixture of the two? And actually this works because we've got some tight controls in the center. We've got people who are specialized in things around maybe data engineering. They can build the right pipelines. Maybe we've got some business analysts who can go out and speak to the business and speak their language. Can you imagine that? Data people, or maybe even data analysts going out and speaking business language. That would be quite revolutionary. It's a joke, but don't laugh too loud. Collaboration was good. We collaborated in this hub and spoke model. We collaborated not just with the business end, but we collaborated back in the center. So there was a tight coupling between the two. They understood each other, or they understand each other. And standardization around the tools that we use, the governance that we put in, the types of dashboards that we might, or the types of products that we might then deliver. But there is complexity around it. People start to drive out different behaviors in the spoke and not really aligned with the hub. Resource allocation is always a problem because how can you start to really increase the resource at the edge and then decrease the resource in the center? So you've got to start thinking about different ways of working, different cultural practices. How do we start to build different teams that can be both central and decentral, which is also an interesting phenomenon, and the potential for silos, which will always happen in these kinds of operating models. The next one is the federated operating model. We've all heard, who's heard of data mesh? No one? Okay. Well, data mesh is the new concept. You know, it came out about a year and a half ago. Everybody's talking about how do you federate everything, you know, into domains. How do you become domain specific and drive data in a domain like product or like sales or like customer or like HR or like finance? And how do we start to build products like that for, you know, closer in those domains? And what that means is each domain has their own team of data people. So the hub and spoke has gone. The central teams have gone. In some cases, sometimes people have a small central team, but really all the responsibility goes down into those domains. They make the decisions. They make the decisions. They make the decisions about tools, about how they're going to organize themselves. They make decisions about what data they need, where it is. They go to their data analyst or their, you know, to do discovery activities and so on. Or they've got data scientists that are thinking about what algorithms to build and what questions or what hypotheses they need to come up with. So, you know, those things around the pros, it is flexible. The local expertise is really business SME input. We want to know what the SME needs are. And that's really sitting opposite them, understanding the business in its context. Why is that particular product not selling in that market? How do we understand what the factors are around that? How do we start to build, you know, maybe a dashboard that outlines what the problem is, but it's being driven by the business teams because they fundamentally understand their own issues and challenges. So they're the ones who are starting to become more data-focused, more interested in how they can help their business. So that's a good thing. It's adaptable, it's efficient, you know. But again, between domains, we're going to have problems. People are going to start saying, this data here is mine. Why are you using it for that purpose? So then we start to have problems with, you know, whose data is it? Well, it's not anybody's data, it's the company's data. So we need to think in the context of process along that. And so process comes into play, but people have now got localized data governance. And localized data governance is a problem because they have their own rules, they have their own practices, they have their own procedures. They don't have a unified view which says, this is how we create business rules. This is how we fundamentally move data from one area to the other. This is the lineage aspect of how we're going to understand the process, which then the data runs through. And then, again, you know, resource duplication, it's always going to be a problem because sometimes, you know, each domains want to swap resources. They want to help others to understand. And for 6 months, they might be in one domain and off they go into another. But they're just beginning a project and they really need to articulate what that is. So this thing is telling me I need to speed up. So where are we on that cycle? What is where do we start? How do we absolutely go from zero to that federated model, that place where we're driving real business value? And, you know, I put it into these blocks. Most organizations, they establish a function, right? Which is a centralized view. The cultural parameters around that are completely chaotic. Nobody knows what the culture is. Everybody's talking about data culture. Nobody understands the business culture, ways of working. Nobody really thinks about that. So it's completely chaotic. Then we move into this kind of midpoint, this proving value out. And I'm just giving you this new thing here called a consulting operating model. Because what I find, the glue between the centralized and hub and spoke is actually the consulting view. Because what we've done here, we've really just got in a data warehouse, we've just got in a platform and we're trying to build it. We're trying to show value, but we're not really getting to that point. The thing that we need is this consulting view of the world. So we need business analysts or consultants, internal, to go in and speak to the business and ask them, what do you need? What are the business questions you're not answering? You know, how do we uncover the right things that you need for your business? So this is fundamentally a consulting operating model. And many organizations use that as a way, as a bridge to getting to that chaotic cultural factor to an observed factor, which is where we start to observe the culture. We start to observe the business use cases. We start to observe the ways of working of the business. Here, it's not done at all. Then we go into the scale, 6 to 12 months. Typically, we come to a hub and spoke view, which is the collaborative culture. We're trying to be more collaborative. We're trying to embed data at the edge, having systematic control at the center, but being flexible enough to deliver good data products. So this then blends, goes from that consulting into the hub and spoke, not saying that the consulting goes away, because the consulting is still needed in some cases to build out some of the reference points for data teams. Now, to get to the scale point, to accelerate and become value-driven, I don't actually agree with the term data-driven. I believe it's not a proper term. It doesn't make sense to me. What organizations should be is value-driven. What data organizations should be are value-driven, not data-driven. So value is what we're looking at, going back to those surveys, the value aspect. And then that's going to be a federated model, which is relentless in terms of your culture. People are understanding each other, people are working together, people are really understanding how they're going to move the wheels, how they're going to move the cogs, how they're going to embed into each other's practices, how they're going to understand business processes and work very clearly in a way that is through the business culture. So it's really understanding that. And the relentless side of it is really because we have got a mindset change. Between collaborative and relentless, we're moving the organization into a new model. We're building out new models, perhaps, new business models. So we're absolutely going against some of the ways that we work right now. Measurement is better. We're going back to proving ROI. We're really working within the business. We're speaking the business language. We're understanding what makes the business money. So that's really how we start to scale and increase that incremental business value. And this is just how I've seen many organizations work, how I've worked with them to implement these practices through different transformation programs. So most of you in the audience are probably working with multinationals, but at a local aspect. And for me, it's really about, consultants love terms, right? So I got a term called S-cubed, strategy and culture. You have a specific strategy and culture here that is different to your masters, whoever they are in the global business team, right? Your culture is part of that culture, but you have a localized view of it. So you've got to start to think about that strategy and culture piece. How do I start to not build a culture, but how do I start to embed into the culture here, bringing in some of that external culture, whether that's an American corporation or a Japanese corporation or whatever it might be. The next thing is scalability, because what you want from that is the scalability effect from all those operating models. Now, there's three ways that you could look at data analytics and AI. The first thing is, I have now started to think about those three things in three separate ways. Data fundamentally needs a centralized operating model. Analytics fundamentally needs a hub and spoke model. AI needs an innovative, at the edge, federated model. So you could coexist within those three different operating models. And the wrapper around that, for me, is the data engineering aspect. So how do we absolutely stitch those things together with the right data at the right time to the right people is the data engineering, which sits off in IT somewhere. I've seen a lot of organizations starting to think about data engineering being hived off into IT. I don't agree. I think data engineering should be as a service for those different organizations. But we can talk about that later. And sustainability. How do I build sustainable models? How do I build, sustainability into what I'm doing? How can I increase the longevity of my transformation rather than thinking of short-term fixes? Because what we want to do, we want to be very strategic. Right now, most people are very tactical in the way that they do things. They're just thinking about what's here in front of their nose. They're not thinking about the end point in 5 years' time, and they're not thinking about the increments that they need to do to get there. So sustainability is a factor. So I would say to you, if you're in that ecosystem, you've got to think global, but act locally on a way that these three areas helps you to do that. And you can only do that through managing the cultural aspect. And as a data person, I come from a business background, and I fell into data. And then I realized that culture is the biggest problem, even before some of those surveys came out. So when I was seeing it, I was really understanding that, data organizations are going to implode if they don't get this cultural practice into place. Quickly go into a success story. Global financial services company, worked with them for about a year and a half, 2 years, started doing their data strategy, worked with the C-suite and the chief data officer to enable them to think about what they wanted to do in terms of that data strategy operating model. I have a 7-wheel framework for data strategy, and anybody who wants to know what it is can come and speak to me later. But let me give you a quick overview of the organization. They deal in debt. They're a financial company, as I said. They had about 3,000 plus portfolios. They had 473 million in portfolio purchases. The amount of income that they brought in the last 12 months was 971 million, and that about 13 billion assets under management. So it's a huge organization which has gone through organic growth. They've acquired through M&A activities and so on. They're owned by a private equity company. So that private equity firm wanted to think about how are they going to exit. The factor was that they said to the C-suite, we need to start thinking about data strategy. We need to start thinking about how we can help data enable the organization in very different ways. So the conundrum for me was, okay, that's fair. You want to exit data and analytics, and now AI and the organization structures and the operating models is what's going to help you get your multiples on exit, get the highest valuation that you can. So it's really down to the operating model, because that delivers and embeds your strategy. It makes it real. So they said, yeah, fine, fair enough. But what they had the basic fundamental challenges when I lifted the cover on everything, and I said, oh my God, you have all of the same problems for a large organization that's gone through so many acquisitions and really wants to get to a point. This was just after the pandemic, and they said, we really want to exit in 2 years' time, which is now. They're just going through their exit now. But they didn't trust data, as you can see. They didn't know where the data was. It took too long to get the data to them. They had done a data governance program for 2 years that had some good stuff in it, but they really hadn't operationalized that in the way that they should have done. Now the hippo always wins the race. I don't know what do you know what the hippo is? The highest, most important person in the office always gets their way, right? The hippo, that's what we call them. So they would always get what they wanted at the detriment of all the other functions. So that doesn't help anybody. And there was no ownership of data, and I say ownership in the fact that they did have the data governance program 2 years before I came in, but they hadn't got any ownership structure. That was one of the points they wanted to think about. Multiple platforms, they had a lot of shadow IT, a lot of shadow BI, they had silos of data everywhere. So these are fundamental challenges that most organizations have. This is just, a view of the areas that they wanted to think about. When I stripped it back and I said to them, this is really what you're thinking about. You're thinking about portfolio pricing. You're thinking about the asset quality valuation of a portfolio. You're thinking about consumer behavior. When are they going to pay up their debt? What plans are you going to put in place for them? Your business performance insight. The CFO did not know his profitability on specific portfolios. That's not good for a CFO. To say that quite openly. So to not have that view of profitability on portfolio, they couldn't go back to the clients that they bought those portfolios off and actually report back to them what the efficiencies of that portfolios are and what revenue they're achieving from it. And operational performance, model development, which is all about customer strategies and collection strategies. So they had to think about what questions are they asking themselves. So we thought about this, which was a virtual operating model, because it started in just post-pandemic when they hadn't got anything in place. People weren't back in the buildings. They had these virtual teams everywhere. They had lots of teams. They had a central data governance team. Like I said, they'd been doing it for a couple of years, which were a good team. They knew their data. They'd actually put a few systems in place which would get them quality scores, which would understand the practicalities around lineage. But what they had is they had other resources decentralized. And those resources were things like data scientists and data analysts and so on. So what they wanted to do really was to say, how do we build something that's going to be a virtual team? So I was thinking, okay, you want to bring people together under this virtual banner that they're going to then come together for a certain period of time to deliver a use case and disband? And they said, yeah, that's what we want, because we want to be efficient. We don't want to invest in these tight structures where we're going to be putting a lot of cash in, because we're thinking about our exit, always thinking about the business strategy. So we sat down and we got into a room and started whiteboarding what it would look like. We came up with this idea of, data squads. You can read their mission. I'm not going to go through all of the pieces. And it enabled them to think about how could they organize, like an amoeba structure, how could they organize these teams, together to bring them into a virtual room, virtual location, a virtual team dynamic in the culture of the business, which, by the way, was terrible, toxic culture. How would they do that in that kind of atmosphere? So what we did was we started to think about capabilities that they needed. I'm just going to quickly take you through the 6 things that we did. So the first thing we did was, well, actually it wasn't the first thing, and I don't know why that's there. So we did this thing called a capability convergence model. Is what capabilities are required in the organization to meet the use cases that you have currently? Not new business use cases, current use cases. When we explored the current use cases, guess what? They were data use cases. They were all around putting a platform in or, buying a new tool. It wasn't based on any kind of activity for the business, any kind of objective which is going to have a specific outcome or business result. So it changed that fundamentally. So that capability convergence model took them through the process in their minds and their business and their culture of how they operate. They had a business culture. We mapped into that business culture. We understood how they work, their ways of working. We tweaked certain things in the data teams to align to that. We didn't tell the business teams everything that the data teams did, because we saved that for another day when they started to understand that this thing actually works in a pragmatic fashion. The next thing we did was actually think about, can we have an end-to-end engagement framework? Now, operating models only work with the right engagement frameworks. And this is from business to outcome. I don't care what happens in the middle, but that needs to be mapped out in a way that those people, the processes, the systems, and the governance, what I talked about earlier in the quadrant, each knows what they're doing at that specific point. And we then decided that we needed somebody in place or a team in place to absolutely manage the demand. So we put in a demand management team because we saw that there was a real large, gaping hole in this process. So just in these boxes here, these are all the people that are required in each step to fundamentally know what they're doing. Starts with the business. The business is always involved all the way through. And these areas are looking at, what are we trying to respond to? What's the business case? What's the cost benefit? And what's the ROI that we're going to get? That's fundamental for a business person. If it didn't give the right outcome or the right ROI, which was linked to about 5 strategic objectives, put it to the side. It doesn't make sense for us to do it. So we needed to think in a far more pragmatic way, which was business aligned, business focused, and people in the business would understand what we're doing. So we spoke their language. We had to retrain some of those data people to understand what EBITDA was, what margin was, how certain products make revenue. So there's certain things that we needed to change in the way that they even spoke and thought about, just so that they could really have good conversations with the business. We started with the business framework, which stems from the data strategy canvas, which helps the business understand business question, decision, action. Simple as that. If a business team knows what they're doing, you don't need to tell them what algorithm or what data it is. They just need to know that you're going to give them those 3 things. You're going to answer the business question. They're going to either make a decision and then take an action. And that's all you want. You don't want anything else. So this end-to-end framework brought together those people, the data engineers, the data governance teams, the demand management teams, the business teams, then in certain cases the CFO's team, because we needed to embed certain principles around business case development. Data teams do not know how to create business cases. Fundamental issue and challenge. Maybe, people out here do, but the companies I've worked with, data people do not know how to fundamentally draw together a business case that says we are going to do this, it's going to cost that, this is the ROI or the outcome we're going to get, and then we're going to look at the intangible benefits. So the alignment with the CFO's team made the data team look good. It helped them with the culture of the business. It helped them speak the language of finance. It helped the finance teams understand the language of data in some ways. So there was a cross-breed collaboration of ideas, concepts, and thoughts, and terms, and language that we could start to build. And then basically all the way through to the technical teams. Once it was passed, we could say, yes, it's passed, it's gone through the gates, certain governance gates. Now, we actually disbanded a lot of the corporate bureaucratic groups, all the big boards that were in place, all the big chiefs that were having meetings for 2 hours every month, and they weren't coming out with a decision. So I said, don't need it. I had some backlash, but I said, okay, tell me, what is the efficiency point of having this, this organization? What are you going to do in this case? So I put the empowerment for making decisions back onto the business person and the data governance team and the data engineering team. So they made the decision. They didn't have to default to any kind of highfalutin, governance council. They didn't. If they could do it, they would draw up an email, send it, and they'd say, we're going to do it. So that was speed to market, that increasing attention to absolutely getting something through instead of waiting on our, sitting on our hands and waiting for a decision to be made. If it made sense to the business, it made sense to those teams, they did it. So that accelerated development times. Then this would be the governance, data engineering, and data science teams. And they would work together, always going back to the business to give them updates through demand management and telling them increasingly what they're going to get or what they're not going to get because they're getting feedback from the data. There's a quality issue here. This data is 40% accurate. It's not going to work for your customer strategy algorithm. It's not going to be able to plan out who the propensity model is not going to work because we won't know who's going to pay back that debt. So we had to be transparent. That's what this engagement framework does as well. It helps people uncover what they should be doing from day one, transparency. And if people don't understand that, then that's not the game that they should be in. And accountability. So that really draws up a lot of the way that we change that dynamic, the culture of the data teams, the virtual teams, and the other ones, stripping down the governance framework, putting in a business questions focused view with automation and workflow. These are just things that we did to make sure that it was seamless, and putting in the change management and comms approach. Now, the change management aspect wasn't stakeholder mapping. It was, hey, listen, how do we change this person's mindset? We need to understand the organization, the way it behaves, the way it thinks, and then we need to change that way if we can. Big changes were needed. Toxic culture, but we needed to understand how we could do that. We needed to move mindsets of people who were with us, who understood what it was, and we needed to work on people who are difficult dissenters. And those people actually became our biggest proponents because they realized the minute we said, what you requested, because they would come to us and say, well, if I put this request in, what normally happens, it takes you 6 months to get it to me. But okay, actually now it's going to take us about 2 months. Is that okay? 2 months? Really? Prove it. So we'd give it to them in about a month and a half. And they were, oh wow, so you can actually do this stuff. Yes, because we've cut out the middlemen, we've cut out all the crap, excuse my language, we've cut out, all the bureaucracy. And so it helped them to see that things could move faster. Just the benefits. What they're actually going through now is that the benefits case for this was 15 million over 3 years. And that actually helped them to increase the multiples for the exit for their organization. They're going through that right now. They're carving out one organization in Germany. They're putting 2 organizations together. And so they're going to absolutely make quite a lot of money on their exit, purely because they had the foresight to think about not only a strategy, but an operating model and how to execute it quickly. So those are the things that they got from this, some of the benefits and outcomes. So how do you choose? The things that I would like you to think about when you go back to your organizations tomorrow, oh, well, not tomorrow, but Friday or maybe Monday, because you might take Friday off. It's, what's the point of going back for one day? Don't say, I didn't say that. Think about the culture of your organization. Think about the business model that you're currently working in. Think about and understand what that business model is. Most data teams that I work with fundamentally won't understand certain parts of their business model. So we give them a business 101. We absolutely drag them into business meetings. And it's key that they're there, even if they're a data engineer, because they understand purpose. And if you understand purpose, you understand the why behind what you're doing. And that's really quite a powerful effect it was have on data teams, specifically those people who are really technical. Once they see it, it's like an aha moment goes off in their mind. Regulatory. The business model could be, are you a regulated business? Are you a FMCG? Do you have customers? What is that kind of business you're thinking about? What's the org structure you have now? How can you blend that org structure to think about a different way that you can implement an operating model, like the data squad, like the virtual operating model? We've never done that before because we always think about, fixed set of individuals sitting on seats in this room. But actually now we're thinking a very, very different dynamic way. And then current capabilities. We have a capability model that actually works out for your business what capabilities you have, what capabilities you lack, and therefore when we start to think about the roadmap, we plot that out and we start to understand the investment cycle that's required over time. Strategy. Fundamental is the middle pillar because you need to know what that business strategy is. What are the strategic objectives? If you don't know that, go back. Ask the question. Go back, read your annual reports. There's so much information in there. I've walked into organizations where I've been asked to come in and speak to teams. And I've known more about their business objectives because I've read their quarterly reports and their annual reports and some of the reports that they might have given to analysts. So I can tell them what the CEOs, or the chairman has asked them to do, even though in every report they say they're AI-driven or data-driven, which always is, wonderful buzzwords. And think about short, medium, and long term. What are you going to do in the short term with that long-term view, but how are you going to build out value? Because value management is one of the skills that nobody actually teaches you at university. The one thing I can tell to ITAM is value management for your data science course, it's needed right from the beginning. If anybody's listening, that's what they need. What are you trying to do? You're trying to optimize, you're trying to, are you looking internally at optimizing processes, or are you thinking about building new products, going out to market? What is it that the organization does? Again, business strategy and model. And the final thing is, who's the sponsor? If you're in a global organization, but in a local sense, it may not be your group chief data officer. It might be your local CFO. Go and speak to them. I wrote a paper around, why data teams should, approach the CFO's team and make them their best friends. So, you need to understand where that's coming from. And also, what do they need? What is it that is going to get them to think about why they need this data stuff? What value can you prove out of the gate that will give them comfort? So they're not giving you millions, but they might be giving you thousands to prove something, or tens of thousands. So those are the three things that you think about. Finally, and I'm almost running out of time, sorry. I'll leave you with this. Warren Buffett said, in a chronically leaking boat, energy devoted to changing vessels is more productive than energy devoted to patching leaks in terms of transformation. So I leave you with this question. How is your company investing more in changing vessels than patching up the leaks? Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Thank you, Samir. Excellent conference.
Quickly, if anybody wants to contact me on LinkedIn, that's my LinkedIn barcode.
Thank you. Excellent conference.
Thank
you so much.
Thank you.
Ronda de preguntas. Empezamos.
Somebody at the back? Oh, somebody at the front?
Yeah.
Hi, Samir.
Hello.
About the change management.
Yes.
Do you think this is a function in the data analytics team, or do you need another? I don't know, another team, another help?
Yeah. So sometimes what we do is where there isn't a specific team that maybe hasn't got a big enough HR team that can absolutely have this unique set of people, we will work with the organization to embed that change management principles into the data teams. And we normally do that. First, we start to educate the teams. We use a tool called ProSci, which actually takes them through, I think, 6 stages of change management, which go from organizational mindset change to the individual mindset change. And it's got, and it's got nothing to do with, as I said, stakeholder mapping. It's all to do with how you change the abstract culture of a business. And we will help them to understand that first, and then they will work with their counterparts. If there is an HR team and they do have a change management team, we still need to train them on that. Because fundamentally, they work in a world which is very different to change management. Change management is really a scientific discipline that many people don't really get. And it's overlooked so many times that even data teams now, the ones that we work with, understand the reasons why they need to be change motivated. And that motivation gives them the understanding of implementing, the hardcore technology that they might, but through the lens of a business view. So it's essential to have either a training program to do that, or to embed an HR function as a side sort of. So in those operating models, I would always have a sort of horizontal, a vertical across those. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Somebody here?
Thank you for your presentation. I have a little question about, you told us about the data teams, analytics teams, and data scientist teams. They all need a special operating model.
Yes.
My question is, how can we get the whole orchestration? Because you told us maybe we need 3 different operating models for each team, but why is those teams are in our big team?
It's the engagement framework.
Yeah.
It's the engagement framework that holds the glue between those. Even if they're 3 different operating models, now you could have, so for example, if you had a global operating model, like a center of excellence, and you had a local hub and spoke, that's 2 different organization dynamics. You're still linked in through an engagement framework with the central global team, but then the engagement framework is localized on the ground through the culture of the organization at a local sense. And that hub and spoke then becomes the de facto organization that you operate in. And that could be, the hub could be the data foundation team,
Okay.
and the spoke could be the analytics or AI team.
Okay.
So you're still working within 3 different dynamics, but it's how you put the processes and engagements between these teams is the glue that actually binds them. How do they speak to each other? How do they actually work through a set of problems? And actually, one of the other things that I didn't mention is, how do we work through problems as a team? That's fundamentally one of the other challenges that data teams do struggle with. And that is in the framework of the engagement model through that operating system or operating model. Yeah?
Thank you.
There was somebody up at the back. Yeah, he's right there at the back. He put his hand up first. So while somebody's getting to you, we'll answer this question down here.
Thank you, Samir. You mentioned on your roadmap at the end,
Yes.
there was the federated model, operation model. So there were still some advantages and disadvantages. What kind of strategies do you suggest so we can mitigate the risks of the disadvantages of this federated model? Special mention to the silos, because in my organization, it's like a really rooted problem, the silos.
Yes.
So how can we get rid of them, or how do we prevent them to form again after we transition this roadmap?
Yeah, so federated model is pretty tough, and that's why you're having those challenges. A couple of things that I would put in place. One is federated teams believe that they can't work in the same fashion, that they all have their different ways of working, which is absolutely not true. So that's the first thing I would do. I would look at process, and I would look at how they engage within their organization, that domain, and with other domains. And again, it goes back to the question, that is an engagement model between different domains. If they can understand how to operate together, they will have less of that kind of silo mentality, because right now it's like dog eat dog. They're only going for their bit, but actually the bit that they've just done in their bit could benefit somebody else greatly. So that's where that dialogue needs to happen, and that's change management. That's the bit which is really not embedded in those teams, the way that they think. So that's one thing. The second thing is, I think federated model is fine, but a federated model in some way still needs a small centralized component. And that small centralized component can still put some of the guardrails around the governance of data. And that's where I think the federated model becomes Wild West, because everybody thinks they can do whatever they want with their data. That's not true. So we need to have a balance between quick, fast operations, managing that and delivering something of value, to making sure we can rein in some of the bad behavior. And to have that central aspect and then to educate those teams is the way it should be done. So an operating model isn't an overnight thing, right? And it's not a cheap thing. But if you're going for a federated model, that means you've invested quite heavily already, probably in technology. And that technology investment is 10 times what it would take to invest in the operating model. So that's the other thing I would say, is go back and think about those educational factors, because most of the time we are starting with education at the beginning, and it's in parallel. Educate value to try and make sure that they can see what they're doing that's having a detrimental effect to other parts of the organization. And that's the federated view, which still needs time to embed itself. Not to say it's not good, but that's what happens. So have that centralized governance. Federated governance is okay still, but that federated governance is when the teams talk to other domains, because they might be using data in a specific way, and they need to make sure that they're not overstepping the mark. So that's another aspect. You can have localized governance as well, as long as it's got some centralized processes that are absolutely key, and no one can go against that. Does that
Thank you very
make
much.
sense?
Yeah, got it.
Okay, thank you for the presentation. I have two questions, actually. The first one is...
Okay, I'll give you two because it took so long to get to you.
Okay, thank you. The first one is, how viable do you think is data mesh? Because it sounds really great in the book, in the theory, in the data contracts, data as a product. Okay, great, but how viable it is to make? And the other thing is, could you give us more detail about the change management process? Because in the day-to-day work, you have challenges like, for example, the words of, I always did this, I always do things in this way, or I won't do that, I don't believe about data, or stuff like that. So, and really changing behaviors and changing mindsets is a really difficult process to make. So,
okay.
Yeah.
That's fine. I will start with the second question first. So whenever we start work with any CEO, the first thing I ask them is, do you have a change management function? And they ask me, why are you asking me that as a data person? And I say, well, because if you don't have a change management function, then I'm not working with you. And then they say, well, why won't you do this? And I say, well, you're never, ever going to get your transformation, whether it's part of digital, whether your data teams are part of digital transformation or they're separate. It will never happen. You will fail 85 to 90% of the time. So I say to them, the first thing I want to do is I want to go in and I want to do a little bit of a landscape assessment against what the organization believes change management is. But key people, I'm not talking about a full sweeping survey, because that again, he'd say, I'm not going to do that, or she'd say, I'm not going to do that, right? So we have a work stream in the roadmap, which is all about change management. And so whenever we do any data strategy work or operating model or implementation or data science work, whatever it is, that change management is the first thing we do, regardless. We have to have that set up, we have to have that function there, and we have to have that assessment, and we report back to the CEO or the C-suite, and we say, these are your deficiencies. This is where you're going to fail, because we know that it's not going to work. This is where you are going to get success. Once they understand that, they don't have a problem. So it's not about the steps, it's about the quantifying why I want to do it at the beginning, as opposed to when they fail at the end, they say, oh my God, why didn't we think about change management? So hopefully I've answered that, right? The first question, look, I don't have any problem with new models like mesh or fabric. The challenge is that when these new concepts come up, I'm going to say this in the nicest way possible. The vendor landscape becomes like a marketing machine. And what it does is suddenly, and I'll give you a practical, I was at Big Data London 2 years ago. It's a very big conference that happens in London. 2 years ago, no one was talking about data mesh. When Zhamak Dehghani came out with her book, The Principles of Data Mesh, or that last year, and she only came out with that book 6 months before Big Data London, which happens now, suddenly everybody had data mesh platforms, right? So I fundamentally disagree with that. What they're doing is the challenge is that organizations then think that this thing called data mesh is easy to implement, when in fact it's not. Because you see from the question here at the front, federating any kind of capabilities comes with challenges. Now, the thing with data mesh is I don't have a problem with it. I think it's actually a really good thing, but it's going to take time to get embedded into an organization. So that's why on that value, the value accelerator piece where you've got the different kinds of mapping to the different stages and the cultural aspects that you're in, I would always get to the point of doing a data mesh, but you start clean and simple with a very simple model, and then you scale to what that data mesh might look like. Because data mesh comes with its own impracticalities around how many tools do we need really to do this stuff? What are data contracts? Now, when data mesh came out, everybody started talking about data contracts. Then you got data governance tools, which started saying we're data contract tools, but they're actually not. They're MDM tools or they're lineage tools. So I think the problem is that we've got to get away from this whole idea that technology solves the problem. It doesn't. It's got to be cultural, strategy, and operating model, because essentially that's what the mesh is. It's an operating model. It's the way that we work, and that's what I like about it. That's what Zhamak Dehghani came up with. It's an operating model to help deliver data products quickly with this thing that can re-emerge and glue itself together and come apart and restitch itself. So I don't think it's a bad thing, just as fabric. Fabric is fabric is just bringing different tools together under one banner. It's not a technology, a utopia. I mean, anyway, I'm not going to go into that because I know that there's, sensitivities around that. So I don't have a problem with data mesh. I think it's not a bad thing, but I think you've got to be pragmatic about where your organization is, what it can tolerate, how culturally beneficial it's going to be for that organization, and is it going to put strain on the data teams? Because that's what it will do. It will put huge strains because you'll say we're going to deliver quicker, but you won't. So hopefully that answers your question. Thank you so much. Anybody else? Gentleman in the middle with the...
Hello.
Hello.
When you were talking about the data squads, you talk about data as a product, but what about data as a service? Is this problem of the centralization? So, look, data products, data as a service, there's even something called data product as a service. I think we get a little bit, we trip ourselves over terms, right? So somebody will tell you a data product is only a data set, yeah? Another person will tell you a data product is a data set as well as an algorithm as well as the dashboard, yeah? All of them are going to deliver something of value, hopefully, when it's... Data as a service is very specific, I think, to self-service activities. One of the things that we did here with the data squads was to help the business teams to self-serve.
And the way we did that was to set up that data as a service kind of mindset, which is when they went on their central platform, I don't need to name the technology, they could search. Say they wanted to say, I need to answer this specific question. That question is already in the database, and so they were searching against that criteria, and they put certain criteria in there. It would say, you have available to you these bits of data. They could serve that data up for themselves instantly with a little bit of workflow that would get that authorized. It wouldn't take 3 months, it would take 1 day, and then they would be able to serve themselves that data, and they would be able to use it in that domain or in their function for whatever they want to do. But they still needed to have that ability to say what it's for. So that's the way I can see, data as a service functioning, in that way. And data products, they're all just terms that have been, now people are talking about data product management because we need to go more to a product management set, which I do agree in some ways because there's got to be rigor behind it. So I think we've just got to come up with less terms and deliver value, in that sense. Does that answer your question? Okay, thank you.